All right. Good morning, and thanks for joining today's discussion of systemic election reform. I'm Kevin Kosar, a senior fellow here at AEI, and I will be moderating today's discussion. As all of you know, elections and how we run them has been debated a great deal in recent years. Elections are a central component of representative government, and how they're structured and administered can have significant effects on the quality of governance. This program focuses on structural election reform, which refers to reforms that are designed to improve the governance by altering the incentives of the candidates running for elective office, particularly in legislative offices. These reforms that we'll be discussing today may include preferential voting, things like ranked choice, open primaries, jungle primaries, runoff elections, proportional representation, and maybe even nonpartisan redistricting. Yes, in fact, we'll talk a great deal about that. As such, we're not going to talk about the administrative electoral forms that get a lot of media attention. Things like alterations to voter identification rules, changes to the number of days of early votings, and other reforms that are important, but nonetheless merely adjust the components of the existing electoral system. Our hope is that at the end of this program, we'll come away with a better understanding of some of the systemic reforms out there and where they're happening in the states. And what have we learned about these things that we're experimenting with? How are they working? Well, not well? Is the jury still out? Now, the structure of this program will have me asking questions of the panel for a time and then taking audience questions. Now, you in the audience, I should say, may submit your question at any time. You can get yourself in the queue early. And you can do this by either emailing your question to jahun.lee, that's JAEHUN.LEE @aei.org. Or for those of you who are on Twitter, or X as I guess it's known as today, you can tweet it to us with the hashtag #AEI election reform. Now, having put that out there, let me move on to very briefly introduce our panel today. First, we have Matt Germer, the Associate Director of the Governance Program at the R Street Institute. Before joining R Street, Matt was a Policy Counsel and Strategic Planning Coordinator at the Washington State House of Representatives. There, he drafted legislation and offered strategic counsel on a variety of legislative matters, and, importantly, one of them was elections. Second up, we have Kevin Johnson, the Executive Director of the Election Reformers Network. He directs the organization's research and advocacy programs that focus on impartial election administration, independent redistricting, and also electoral college reform. He has more than 20 years of experience in election reform study and activity. Last, but most certainly not least, we have the Gene Krebs. He's working on governance reform in Ohio when he's not running his farm. He spent 8 years in the Ohio House of Representatives as a Republican, and he was a member of the famous Caveman Caucus, the most conservative wing of the Republican Party. So with that, let's open our conversation on the state of systemic election reform in the states. And I want to begin by putting a question to each of you, which is, there are lots of issues out there that you can spend your time on. What got you interested in systemic election reform, and which reform or reforms particularly interest you? And I want to start first with you, Matt Germer.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you for the rest of the panelists for this event. I'm so excited and grateful that you invited me and that AEI is interested in this topic. It's long been an interest and really passion project of mine. I have been invested or interested in systemic election reform since I was a college student, basically. I was one of those kids growing up who would read the rules of board games and would be grumpy by house rules being added, because I noticed early on how rules can shape incentives and behavior. Look, there should be no money when you land on free parking in Monopoly. It drives inflation. It extends the game. Bad rule. And those same kinds of incentives that get created by shaping the rules also applies to elections. I got a chance to witness the impact of this firsthand, working in the state legislatures in Oregon and in Washington State, particularly in Washington State, where I spent a little over 4 years working for the Republicans in the House of Representatives there. And I saw firsthand how electoral structures can shape political behavior. Washington is one of those states that uses a top two electoral system, or did during the years, and still does while I was there. that requires a jungle primary where all candidates appear on that primary ballot together, and the top two move on to the general election. And I was able to see how that structure impacted the way legislators behaved, the way that they interacted with their constituents. And it drove an interest of mine to see the ways in which the primary system across the rest of the country could learn from Washington, both the things that worked well, in my view, as well as the things that could be improved. And to that point, I think there's a major opportunity for improvement in our nation's primary system. To me, that's really where the structure provides the most opportunity for benefit. And at the end of the day, and I think we'll get into this as we talk, I'm really encouraged by the top four system that's been implemented in Alaska. I know other options exist. I think that other options could be very promising as well. But of those that have been implemented thus far, that one to me holds the most promise.
All right. Thank you, Matt. How about you, Kevin?
Thank you, Kevin, and I'll echo Matt in saying I really appreciate being here. And as I said as we were talking before, hats off to you for the report. I thought it was really excellent and a great contribution to this discussion. So I came to this following spending most of the 90s overseas, working on emerging democracies that came about after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Fascinating experience. In many of those countries, the fundamental constitutional issues were on the table. What kind of election system, how to organize election administration, proportional representation, single member districts, all of these issues. To be helpful, we had to help inform decision makers about the options, and that gave me the kind of education most Americans don't get into the range of systems and structures that can be used. And I came away from it with sort of two core feelings about American democracy. And the first was just tremendously renewed admiration for what our democracy symbolizes and continues to symbolize around the world. I worked with hundreds of people who wanted freedom and followed the American beacon in wanting freedom. On the other hand, no one wanted our systems. They wanted systems that had begun to emerge in some of our other peer democracies where innovation has taken place that we frankly have fallen behind. So it was that experience, that set of thinkings that led me to start Election Reformers Network. We work on structural reform. Right now, we work primarily on advancing impartial election administration and nonpartisan redistricting. And we think of those reforms as both moving toward a situation where parties have less control over election rules and where competition is based on you win and lose with your ideas and your campaigns, not by controlling the rules. So that's sort of the background I brought to it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you much, Kevin. And I should mention, since you brought it up, the report to which Mr. Johnson referenced was a report that AEI published that I wrote back in October. It was called Conservatives Should Look More Closely at Systemic Election Reforms, and you can find it out there just by Googling those terms or going to the Twitter or the X and looking under the hashtag pound AEI election reform. Now to you, Gene. You were a politician, a practitioner of the arts of representation, and now you're into systemic reform. Tell us the story.
So back in about 2015, AHA Publishing asked me to co-author a book with them called Bridges Across Every Divide that looked at and explained for poverty advocates how you actually should advocate. And I will sum up that in another book I did for them very briefly as saying, anytime you have lunch alone at your desk, that's a wasted opportunity. All else is commentary. And then they paid me for the commentary. Okay. The reason they asked me to write this book is if you look behind me, you'll see those panoramic photos that you see in all offices of all recovering politicians. These are the panoramic photos they take when you're a member. When I was a member of the House, I had 10 bills signed into law. After I left the House, I went into think tank world. I once again had 10 bills signed into law in Ohio without a PAC. And what the FBI said is that we've always known for some time, Ohio is probably the most corrupt state. Okay, so how are you able to do this? Well, in looking at this issue of how to help poverty, and by the way, if poverty advocates were really doing their job, we would not have the benefit cliff. I mean, let's face it. Okay, they'd be able to advocate that away. So I gave them insights on how to do that, but in doing so, I decided to keep peeling back the onion, so to speak, as to what were the core reasons. I kept coming back to our partisan spring primary as being one of the major culprits, as you can't get people to focus on general issues, but only very narrow, specific issues where 8% of the people, 8% of the voters control 83% of the legislative seats. So I started looking at it, and I kept coming back to this issue of, a Alaska-style election system, open primaries in the spring, followed by a ranked choice in the fall. Started organizing other retired elected officials and other poli-sci professors, and we started talking about this. I attracted a pedigree Democrat, Sean Logan, former ODNR Ohio Department of Natural Resources Director, and a Democrat, Ted Strickland. He also has served with me in the House. We're good friends. We have collaborated on farmland preservation. And from that, we started then talking about this across Ohio. It's gone quite well. We have talked to maybe 100 people, and we've had 94 of them finish our sentences for us. So we know this is going well. And we're looking to perhaps go on the ballot at some point in time in the future, next couple of years, with this, not in 2024, but to go with some flavor of election reform, either the final 4 or maybe a final 5. That's to be determined.
Well, just to follow up with you, Gene, and to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, you said there's some issues with the system. And as I understand it, one of the thoughts is that ranked choice voting would some way alter the systemic issues you're seeing or have experienced in Ohio. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Like what are the vices, and where does the systemic reforms that you favor kind of fit in?
So the way we view it here is that ranked choice voting in the general election basically institutes an aspect of game theory into your elections, kind of like the reverse of the prisoner's dilemma that they currently face. Okay. And that is, now if you have multiple candidates running for one spot and you get to vote for any one of multiple candidates, now you want to, if you're a candidate, speaking as a recovering candidate, you want to stay pleasant and nice when talking about your other opponents and keep your observations limited to policy and not to the politics of personal destruction. And so for that, it raises the civility level, and you get more of a discussion about policy, and that's what we're all trying to get towards in this. We're looking for a fair fight on the policy issues.
Got it. Kevin Johnson, let me turn to you. My sense is that many voters would agree that it's problematic to have a majority political party drawing congressional district lines that ultimately advantage itself. In fact, it's difficult to find, when I go back and visit my home state of Ohio, anybody who says, yeah, this is a great idea. It probably to them, to some degree, seems a bit like allowing the home football team to decide where its offense gets to start with the ball. Like, of course, they're going to put it right on the 1-yard line of the other team. So is independent redistricting, happening more and more in the United States? Is there a movement? Is it rising? Is it stalled? Where is it at, and what's happening?
Great questions. And yes, I think that assumption about how voters see this is correct. And yes, independent redistricting is happening. It's unfortunately a little bit complicated. So I'm going to ask the indulgence of your audience to go give a couple slides to sort of try to show the landscape. So I'm going to click over to my slide deck here and hit share. And I assume everyone can see that. And I just have to first say, this gentleman here, of course, is a baseball umpire calling balls and strikes. The younger generation on my staff are like, why do we have the old white guy out here and what's he doing? So just we use this image to embody really what we try to do at ERN, which is kind of fill in a missing piece of our democracy, which is neutral referees making important decisions. So to the premise of your question, regarding voting support and do people feel that it's sort of abusive? Just a couple quick pieces of data here. Economist poll from 2022 shows that roughly mid-60s% of Republicans, mid-70s% of Democrats, maybe a little bit hard to see on the screen, support giving power to a nonpartisan redistricting commission over the redistricting process. That polling support is borne out in the actual voting results of 5 ballot initiatives on the right in 2018. The column in the middle shows the overall approval. The column on the right shows the approval in counties that Trump won by 25% in 2016. You add it all up, and nearly 60% of voters in counties Trump won by 25 points or more voted yes to fundamental reform of redistricting. In a way, it shouldn't surprise us that Republicans support this. For one, Ronald Reagan was one of the great advocates for redistricting reform. For two, it's about sort of the self-serving that Republicans have always been critical of and have always sort of worked to try to correct. You were asking where we are in terms of, to what extent different approaches to redistricting or different approaches to controlling abuse of redistricting power, how that is working across the states. This map tries to summarize that, and we break down states into 5 different categories here. The green states are those that have a fully independent citizens commission that is separate from the legislature, that has the constitutional right to draw the maps. Those maps become law. The yellow states are states that are kind of close to that level. They have an independent commission that isn't completely independent. Many of its members may in fact be named by the legislature, but it has become functionally independent and really puts a good kind of guardrail on partisan abuse by the majority party in the legislature or by the inclination to solely protect incumbents. The next level down are states where courts have a set role in policing gerrymandering, and I can come back to kind of the different court decisions that have shifted courts into more of a prominent role. But if you put all that together, that's 11 now. And then on the right, there are 4 states that are likely moving, toward a less risk of abuse category. So Utah, ballot initiative in 2018 and set up an IRC, which the legislature overturned. The court is likely to reinstate. Supreme Court may well reinstate that. There's a 2024 Independent Redistricting Commission referendum that's gathering signatures in Ohio that polling shows has a good chance of winning. And Wisconsin and New Mexico are both likely to have state Supreme Court decisions that read the constitutional right to an election where gerrymandering, that makes elections not equal and not fair, can be reviewed by the court. So that's kind of the status at this point. And I'm going to stop the share and I'll come back to some other questions, data in here a little bit later on.
All right, very good. Very good. Yes, I definitely have a few follow-up questions about that. Interesting.
Yeah, like what do you mean by this? What is this? Yeah, exactly. I'm ready.
All right, but first I want to turn over to Matt. Instant runoff elections, you mentioned final 2, final 4. First thing I want to ask is, for the sake of the audience, so that we're all on the same page, like what do we mean by final 2 or final 4? And is that the same thing as an instant runoff or jungle primary? So we get that nomenclature clear. And then I wonder if you could talk about Alaska's new experiment with final 4. What did we learn from that?
Thanks, Kevin. Those are good questions. And I think it's good level setting questions too, to make sure we're all on the same page with what is meant by an instant runoff. I think many folks around the country have been hearing a lot about ranked choice voting. It's been a subject in the news. We've seen a number of states go off and try to affirmatively, preemptively ban it. even though it's not in the state. While at the same time, we've seen a number of states embrace it, whether it's at the local level or states like Maine or Alaska that have started using it statewide. And I think it's important to recognize kind of what these terms are and what we mean. So an instant runoff election is often thought of as an election that uses ranked choice voting to conduct an instant runoff as part of the electoral process. So voters will be presented with multiple candidates on the ballot. They will rank those candidates based on their own personal order of preference. All of those first choice votes will be counted by election administrators. In an instant runoff election, the last place candidate is eliminated. That candidate's voters, their votes are allocated then to those voters' second choices. The tabulation is performed again, and the process continues until one of the candidates earns a majority of votes. It functions like a runoff election folks might be familiar with in states like Georgia, where runoffs have become really, again, a national story. In a state like Georgia, if no candidate receives 50% of the vote in November, the top two candidates advance forward to a runoff in what is now December, what was previously January. An instant runoff performs that function instantly. It performs that function using the November election, or using really any election where you're conducting an instant runoff on the spot. So in a state, maybe valuable to look at would be a state like Alaska. And so in Alaska, they have combined an instant runoff in the general election with primary reform in the primaries. So in Alaska, all candidates, regardless of party, appear together on the same primary ballot. This is what's referred to in many places as a jungle primary. It's not a partisan primary. Voters can pick from among all candidates from all parties as they work their way down the ballot. States like Washington and California also use a jungle primary. Washington and California then advance the top two jungle primary winners to the general election. Alaska advances the top four to the general election. In states like Washington and California, it's pretty straightforward. People vote for one candidate they like in November. That candidate wins. It's a head-to-head matchup in November. In Alaska, they employ an instant runoff using ranked choice voting. So in those races, there are up to 4 candidates. There doesn't have to be 4. If there are fewer than 4 candidates who even file in the first place, you'll get 2 or 3 or whatever it is, what have you, in the general. But you'll get up to 4 candidates. Voters will rank those candidates. And once all of the ballots are collected, the instant runoff is conducted. One candidate receives a majority of support from the voters and is declared the winner. I think it's worth reflecting for just a moment on how that has gone in Alaska. So that new process was adopted by initiative and was only implemented for the 2022 electoral year, which included all of the statewide elections for governor and statewide elected office, for state legislature, and perhaps famously for the state's U.S. Senate seat and their at-large congressional district. Perhaps unsurprisingly to most Americans, Alaska is perceived as a red state. They tend to vote Republican for president. And so Republicans did quite well in Alaska under this new system. It maintained their majority in the legislature. Republicans won the seat for governor. They won the seat for U.S. Senate. Perhaps maybe also famously, a Democrat won the seat for the at-large congressional district. This is where I will note for just a moment that Alaska, despite being a red state most Americans are familiar with, is also a fairly moderate and independent state on a variety of policy fronts. It is a pro-choice state. I think something like 63% of Alaskans identify as pro-choice. It was one of the first states to legalize marijuana. It is a state that has a program called the Permanent Fund Dividend that almost works like universal basic income that's tied to the mineral rights in the state. There are a lot of unique factors that are at play in Alaska. And so that congressional election, which I think caught a lot of attention because Democrat Mary Peltola defeated 2 Republican candidates, and notably one of those was Sarah Palin for the seat, that a lot of folks might think that this new system was responsible for that outcome. I will note that Mary Peltola ran on a very moderate campaign in favor of oil exploration and commercial fishing. It was almost a bipartisan campaign. I think she and Senator Lisa Murkowski cross-endorsed each other. So it was an election where the Democratic candidates seem to recognize that this new system of voting that might involve rankings, that involves elements of civility, would incentivize the kind of behavior of showing cross-partisan appeal. And that's what happened. In that particular race, Peltola ended the first round with the most first-place votes, but not a majority. The third-place finisher was a Republican, Nick Begich, who was perceived as being a bit more of a I don't know if moderate's even quite the right word, but more of a moderate Republican. And so his votes were reallocated, and enough of them chose Mary Peltola over Sarah Palin, that Peltola won the election. And so as I look at this, it seems like to me, the system is working quite well in Alaska about realigning incentives. Republicans still did very well across the entire state, as again, might be expected in a state like Alaska. But we also saw campaigns where the more civil candidate who engaged with a cross-partisan appeal as part of their campaign did quite well. I think the other one worth noting, besides the more kind of nationally famous race for Congress, is a race for state legislature, particularly the state Senate. I think it's State Senate District E. In Alaska, I believe they letter them rather than number them, where we saw 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat facing off in what was a predominantly Republican district. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, because it was a predominantly Republican district, the Democrat was eliminated first in the ranked choice instant runoff, which meant that the race came down to 2 Republicans. Those Democratic voters had their second choice votes counted instead, and Republican Kathy Giessel won the seat. And this is an example of how the new system in Alaska was empowering candidates who had broad support among a majority of their constituents. I find this incredibly heartening, because it means that if you are someone like how I have been growing up as a conservative in California and Oregon and Washington, who often finds myself feeling like I have no political power, this new kind of instant runoff system gives a bit more voice to all voters, including minority party voters. And so, yeah, I think it's maybe hopefully a high level summary of how things have been going in Alaska. And happy to talk about this more if we have any follow-up questions.
All right. Yes, indeed, we will. I want to circle back to Gene to bring up a point that has come up already about primaries, the partisan primary as a tool for selecting who gets to be on the general ballot come November. What are your thoughts on partisan primaries? What's your experience as somebody who's run through that system or seen it up close?
The partisan primary becomes a litmus test as to where you are on 2 issues, abortion and guns, or as we say in Ohio, babies and bullets. And that is an inadequate way to allow the general population to sift through your candidates. Once again, what the primary does is, if it's a partisan primary, it allows you to only sift through the candidates on those very narrow topics. And then those candidates are not well prepared or well vetted for the general to be able to succeed in a broadly competitive district, or to be able to represent the vast majority of the citizens. Go back a little bit to what Matt was talking about Alaska and why that has so much appeal. So think about this as a sifting mechanism. You're sifting. Voters have 2 different ways to sift through their candidates. First, with that, jungle primary bedsheet ballot, we call it in Ohio in the spring. Okay, top 4. You go and vote for one, top 4, move on. Then you have a different sifting mechanism in the fall with that ranked choice. I often liken this to, what is my favorite flavor of ice cream? We talk about election reforms. There are many different flavors out there. My personal favorite is salty caramel. Now, when you think and deconstruct that, that's just weird. You've got salt in an ice cream, and caramel makes sense. Okay, but you combine them and you get absolutely wonderful ice cream. Same thing applies with this type of Final Four you're seeing in Alaska, or maybe Final 5 in Nevada. By comparison, there's also some flavors out there of reform that I liken to black licorice ice cream. Somebody has to like it, okay, for this to get proposed. And you see them out there on occasion. They're just really weird variations of these reforms. But you know what? Everybody has their own favorite flavor of ice cream. And if the citizens in one community like black licorice ice cream and a really odd variation of election reform, let them go for it. This is supposed to be, as Brandeis said, we're supposed to be laboratories of democracy. Let everybody experiment a little bit, though you don't, please don't share your black licorice ice cream with me.
So it sounds like, your experience in Ohio, the use of the partisan primary is not tending to produce, at least for the GOP, candidates who are anywhere near the average voter. And so what you get as a voter when you show up in November is, I've got two choices, maybe neither are particularly appealing, but you're going to then pick on the basis of either, well, I don't like Democrats, so whomever the Republican guy is, I'll pick, or some other sort of simple toggle. Is that right?
Well, yes, except that I would say long term, my Republican people here are, the general population that tends to vote Republicans are, think of it as this way. We talk a lot about the body politic, and the Republicans in the state house have managed to create an immune response going on in the general public right now. If you go back to August in Ohio, talking about election reform, in Ohio, we had a very famous special election in August here to increase the threshold by which a constitutional amendment could be approved to 60%, plus more dangerously broadened that you had to get signatures from all 88 counties, which would have just made it truly only a billionaire's playground at that point in time. That went down pretty successfully. 57% of the people said, no, we don't want to see this reform. And what that has done is kind of like now produced an immune response in the general population. Polling in Ohio indicates only 6% of Ohioans believe their legislature is doing an excellent job of representing their views. Now, John Boehner was my mentor, and he said, anytime you get below 10% on that number, you're now talking to friends and family zone. These are people who who you've actually had lunch or drinks with, okay? And that's where we are in Ohio. So these are all danger signs for my Republican Party. And as my colleague Sean Logan in this effort here in Ohio, my Democrat colleague, we're from opposite sides of the state, opposite sides of the aisle, we come together in this issue, is he says that whichever party most fully embraces these types of reforms will be the one that will capture the imagination of the next generation. Because I'm 70, and too many Republicans look like me and are my age. And one more personal thing, they got me out of retirement to be able to go ahead and advocate on this stuff. My dad died at age 80. I'm going to use up a quarter to a third of my time I have left on this one issue.
All right. Yeah. And I should just mention, as a data point, when I looked at the turnout in the GOP primary election that was deciding who would be the next U.S. senator from the state, which turned out to be J.D. Vance. That was a big election, a high-profile choice to be made, and I think maybe a quarter of eligible voters showed up in the GOP primary, which if that's the sorting mechanism you're using for figuring out who should run in the general, it's a minority.
And compare it famously to Virginia, where the GOP there went through for their convention, went through a ranked choice process, came up with Youngkin, who beat a former governor of Virginia, and for the first time since 2009 turned what had been a blue state, at least purple, and he carried through with him a whole lot of fellow Republicans 2 years ago.
Yes. Kevin Johnson, I want to return to you. I know you have a couple of slides to show, but I also want to ask you, some of our audience members may recall that, in the state of New York and Ohio, there were some real battles over redistricting recently, and in each instance, ended up in the courts. And if memory serves, in the case of Ohio, the court couldn't really force a remedy to occur. Whereas New York, they kind of kicked redistricting to a special master, like an outside individual who was appointed, and kind of what that master drew up either had to be accepted or at least voted on. Can you catch us up on the details of that and whether those differences on those two states are particularly illuminating about this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have to go back and refresh myself on the details of. I believe that was a provision of the New York enabling legislation. Different states will prepare for court roles at different levels. So, for example, Virginia went through an interesting redistricting reform a couple of years ago. Big debate in the state about whether and how to set up a commission. There were some advocating for the fully independent commission. The Democrats won control of the legislature, and that made them less interested in the fully independent commission. And so they came up with a kind of agreement to have a combination of, I think it's 6 politically appointed members and 6 independent members, with an element of the statute saying if they gridlock, the court gets the full right to draw it. That doesn't have to be adjudicated in court. It's an automatic process. And I believe New York has a similar provision. I'll have to go back and check. But that's one of the reasons that we categorize some of the states in that map as being court policed. And I'm going to mention a second, which is an area we've done a lot of work, which has to do with the concept of how courts and whether courts can police gerrymandering. And here, as most folks know, the Supreme Court said, no, we can't. It's too arbitrary. It's too political a concept. In Rucho versus Common Cause, they said this issue is non-justiciable. Justice Kagan wrote the dissent saying, that's ridiculous. We make decisions on these kinds of things all the time. And here is a set of tests that can be used to assess whether to look at a map and come to a determination of whether this is a partisan gerrymander that violates principles or not. We led a group with a bunch of redistricting experts to write the amicus brief that develops how that test can be implemented. And we believe more and more states will start to use it. New Mexico and Alaska have both effectively decided that their courts now have policing power over redistricting based effectively on those same kind of principles. So that's been sort of the evolution. And I think there are going to be more and more states where courts play a pretty effective role. And that's valuable because the independent redistricting path is always going to be constrained to a pretty significant extent by concerns about unilateral disarmament, right? You may think that in general, it's better for all states to have redistricting not controlled by the legislature. But if you're legislature in a red state or in a blue state, why would you move first before the other side's going to move? So that's been a pretty, and I want to say a little bit more about that later on. The slides that I have are sort of around the topic of how well the independent redistricting is working. Should I pick up on that topic, Kevin, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hear about that.
Okay, great. And I'm going to preface this just to connect to the conversation that you and Jean have been having about kind of the way in which, a system that elects representatives that are far from the median voter of the party, that can't be in the long-term interest of the party. If it particularly, and it starts to drive polling below 10 into the friends and family category. So I think one of the things that's been implicit but should be made explicit in this call is that when we're talking about what's working, we're not talking about what's working from some ivory tower perspective, some reform academic perspective, or some good guy, moral is better kind of perspective. We're talking about it from the perspective of the party's own interests. And all of these reforms will help them govern better, which in turn will help them be reelected and help them have a more governable environment. I think that's an important thing to note. And that's really particularly true about redistricting, because I think we've learned 2 things from the commissions that have been established. The first is that they are working, and the second is that they are incredibly needed. And I'm just going to quickly do a couple slides to illustrate those points, if you just stay with me just a second. So on the second of those 2 points I made, incredibly needed, This is a map of the way in which the districts in the United States have gone from having a mix at the top. If you look at 1996, some districts that were definitely blue, some definitely red, some leaning, and a good number, nearly 100 right in the middle. 2022, according to this analysis, we have 41 that are competitive. I've seen other analysis that give that number at 30. What that means is all of those members on the other sides in the solid blue and solid red, their incentives are driven around not being primaried. Their main objective is to stay far enough to either the right or the left that they can't have someone challenge them. And that often will mean the last thing they want to do is compromise. And this is a system, the founders wrote a system that depended on compromise. So all of this is happening not solely because of redistricting. Most of it is happening because of self-sorting. We are moving to be with politically like-minded people. But the more that moving happens, the more we have a system that incentivizes, that gives political power to the extremes, which I gotta believe if you're in Capitol Hill right now, makes life absolutely miserable. It certainly means that we never pass a budget under regular order. It means that we can't get folks together and just even be amicable. So there's all sorts of, purely self-interested reasons why this is not something that folks should want to continue. That's the first piece. We need it. The second piece, it's working. One way to show that it's working is that 3/4 of that 41 in the middle were drawn in the about 10% of districts that are controlled by commissions or are in those states that I identified as being court policed. So we're getting many more competitive districts out of the states that have adopted those reforms. That's one way to look at the way this is working. Here's another, if I can get the slide to advance. This is sort of long-term perspective, looking at gerrymandering cycles and US House elections. You can see on the left under 1982 and 1992, while Ronald Reagan was such an advocate of reform and gerrymandering, the Democrats took full abuse and full benefit of this system. But you can do different things with data, but what I'm trying to show a pattern here that as the green line is the number of states that either have a commission or have court oversight, and it's been growing. And as it has been growing, it has taken the number of state seats that are open for redistricting out of circulation. And it also has begun to restrain toward what we might consider a parity. So 2022, so this graph looks at the excess seats above what the party vote share was. So in 1982, the Democrats won a majority of votes, but the number of seats was actually 30 seats higher than what you would expect just based on the percentage of the votes nationwide for Congress that they got. That's how this graph works. 2022, there is only a 2-seat difference between the vote share of Democrat and Republicans and the seat share of Democrat and Republicans. Both gerrymandered, and to some extent, that's because there was sort of a wash between the amount of gerrymandering on the two sides. But what this begins to create is if you have parity, you have both sides can have a benefit in moving beyond this system. And I'm going to stop share there just to say a word more about this, because the context for this webinar is structural reform, what's happening in the states. We shouldn't forget that the Constitution gives Congress the right to regulate the time, place, and manner of elections as well. And it explicitly allows them to supersede state rules. As for federal elections, Congress could very definitely pass legislation that sets standards on redistricting that could reduce the kind of abuse that happens in the worst of redistricting. Bills have been raised calling for mandating that states have independent commissions. I don't think that's an acceptable principle from a conservative perspective, that kind of mandate. But the last round of the Freedom to Vote Act moved from mandating actual structures to just setting up principles. Redistricting should not, I'm going to get the exact language, redistricting shall not be done in a way that empowers one, that is unfair to one party. I'll have to come back and get the exact language from the bill. But there, if you see the parity that I mentioned in that slide, you start to see a point where this is not like, hey, my side's going to win, I don't want any reform, or my side's going to win, I don't want any reform. There's an opportunity for both sides to get the benefit that they need in terms of moving away from these safe districts that create the kind of crazy incentives that we're living with.
All right, thank you. Audience, I want to remind you that you may get your questions in the queue. You can do that by two means. You can email them to jehun.lee@aei.org. That's JAEHUN.LEE@AEI.org. Or you can go on to the platform known as X and tweet them at us by using the hashtag #AEI election reform. Yeah, I should mention, since I'll ask you at the very beginning how you came to systemic election reform, I should mention how I got here. And I spent 11 years as a civil servant researcher working at the Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress, which afforded me a front row seat to watching our national legislature. And I was astonished at how much Congress, the House in particular, its behavior was driven by the fact that members were facing primaries in the short term and elections every 2 years. There's a rhythm that had clearly developed, which is, if you have a fresh majority roll into the House of Representatives, they would immediately tee up a series of messaging bills that were designed to signal to the primary voters, we heard you, we're translating your priorities into legislation. The way they structured the work calendar, when they took time off to go back to the states, was often very neatly tied into considerations of reelection. What amendments were even allowed on particular legislation? If a member was in a marginal district and was trying to, have a tough reelection challenge, whether it was from the right in the primary or general, they would set that member up to be able to get a high profile vote, which could then be used as kind of marketing materials. It was really something. And what was kind of lost was an incentive to get together and work on the really tough stuff, like the spiraling deficits and debt, like the screwed up immigration and border control system, like you can name any number of high salience issues that just have not seen serious legislative action. But enough of me. Matt, I want to turn back to you. This program, we're talking about action in the state. What's the state of play? And you've been telling us a bit about the instant runoffs, the final 2s and 4s. We've heard about Alaska putting this system in recently. Are there other states that are looking at doing this right now?
There are, and I would, if I can, indulge for just a second. I want to piggyback off of something Kevin brought up in his answer in his last discussion around redistricting, and then I'll get to this particular question around what's going on in other states, because I think in some ways they're related too. As Kevin pointed out, we've been self-sorting as Americans, finding politically similar places to live. I am one of those. I grew up on the blue West Coast as a conservative, and I now live in the suburbs of Charlotte, in a neighborhood that is purple but leans red. And I don't think I picked the neighborhood because of its politics. I picked the neighborhood for a variety of other factors, but I absolutely fall within the category of someone who's self-sorted. And I think it's perhaps not surprising then, based on all the factors that Kevin laid out, why it is that Americans, or why primary elections are those determinative elections. And I want to share one of those statistics that often gets brought up in this discussion, but for many of our audience, they may not have heard it before. But that in 2022, 83% of the U.S. House was elected by 8% of Americans. And to unpack that for just a second, because the vast majority of districts, as Kevin pointed out, are in districts that are either, you can consider them gerrymandered or sorted, or otherwise are just non-competitive in the general election. The determinative election is the primary. And primaries are low turnout. And in many states, they are exclusive only to members of the identifying party. And because of the low turnout and the low amount of people who are even legally allowed to participate in that election, very few people are actually deciding who it is that goes to Congress to represent all of us. So to kind of, again, it's 83% of the House elected by 8% of Americans. And I think that statistic is jarring enough that this discussion around primary reform has popped up, not just in somewhere, that to many of us in the lower 48 feels far off, like Alaska, but that we are seeing efforts across the entire country on this, whether it's through the legislature or through ballot initiative. I think the most promising is not quite the right word, but just the most successful effort thus far has been in Nevada. In the 2022 election, they passed an initiative, Question 3, that would institute Final 5 voting. I think very similar to Alaska's Top 4, just instead of advancing 4, you advance 5. And that passed by 6 points in Nevada. The way Nevada's initiative system works is a little unusual for folks who live in states that have ballot referenda. I believe in Nevada, you have to pass the initiative twice. So they passed it in 22. It'll be up again on the ballot again in the future. Worth noting that most of the polling in advance of the election thought that this initiative was going to go down in flames. The Republicans, as I mentioned very early on in our discussion today, have soured on the concept of ranked choice voting for reasons that, to me, don't really align with party principles. And at the same time, in Nevada, a state that has a pretty practiced democratic machine, recognized that by empowering civility and empowering candidates who represent the entirety of their constituency, that might create some disruption to the status quo. And so I think the Democrats in Nevada also, as a party, were pushing against the reform, and yet the people of Nevada showed that they still wanted it. This is one of those things, maybe it's out there with conversations like term limits, or like as Kevin has brought up around independent redistricting, where the parties often identify that they are concerned about this, but the people want it. And so we saw that in Nevada, they voted for it. It'll be up again. We'll see if it passes there. Then Nevada will be the next state to implement this type of reform. We're also seeing statewide initiatives in states like Arizona. I think they're in the signature gathering phase for this reform. That's a state that's incredibly interesting to me. I know that a lot of folks have been paying attention to Arizona politics just because of its increased prominence within the context of presidential races. But that's a state where a lot of voters are starting to feel like both parties are not representing the median voter, that each of them are really playing to their base, and there's a substantial pent-up frustration among many Arizonans. And so that's a state I'm keeping my eye on. The other one I'll mention as kind of a key state is Wisconsin. That's a state that, as I recall, does not allow for statewide referenda to change voting laws. And so they would have to come through the state legislature. And yet there seems to be some momentum among the legislature. So despite what I mentioned before about a state like Nevada, where the parties and the establishment itself were concerned about this reform, the Wisconsin legislature has been open to it. They've introduced bills in their legislature with bipartisan sponsors, with interest from both sides, because I think they are recognizing that the people are frustrated. And since Wisconsin doesn't have that initiative process, it puts extra pressure on the legislature to act. And so I'm also keeping an eye on that state as an opportunity for reform. And perhaps unsurprising for folks who are kind of historians of state politics, Wisconsin is and has long been a state that has championed primary and electoral reforms dating back to the progressive era 100 years ago. I believe they were one of the first states that kind of moved out of the smoke-filled rooms of selecting candidates in the first place and instituted party primaries. And so in some ways, it would be fitting if they were one of the early adopters as well of the next frontier of primary reform.
No, thank you, Matt. And I would add into that here in Washington, D.C., there is a move to try to enact a Final Four type system. And this is occurring in a town where Republicans simply do not hold office. They may be part of the population. There is also a significant number of independents here. But government here in Washington, D.C., the municipal government, District of Columbia government, is inevitably controlled by either outright Democrats, full-on progressives, or folks who identify as independents, but by any measure of the political spectrum, you're going to find out that they are on the left. Now, interestingly, we just had an audience question come in that ties into something you were talking about, Matt, but I definitely want to get Gene's take on this because there's a politics aspect to it. Coming from somebody in Wisconsin, we've got a question that says, I'm seeing pushback from my fellow Republicans against Final Five voting in Wisconsin. What success have you had in changing someone's mind to go from not supporting it to supporting it? Do you have any suggestions on ways to approach those who don't support it at all? So why don't I go right to you, Gene, because you no doubt are having these conversations in Ohio.
Yes, and it comes down to how happy are you with the current situation? Since both Matt and Kevin have brought up term limits, I have to refer that. We have that in Ohio. It's 8 years, which means literally every 2 years, we take out about a quarter of the current General Assembly and we say to them, go away. So whatever you've learned, go away. So that means the evolution of the Ohio legislature occurs more quickly here than other General Assemblies. This has led to two things for us here. Like I mentioned before, we are the most corrupt state in the country, according to the FBI. Not a badge I want to wear proudly. But we're also seventh in population and second smallest General Assembly. What that means is that it costs us $2 million to buy a state Senate seat, about $500,000 to buy the campaign for a state House seat. Okay. And so that leads to further graft and corruption. For Wisconsin, but in Ohio, our General Assembly is absolutely dysfunctional. And it's gotten worse over time. It's gotten worse in the quarter century since I've left. So the question is to ask yourselves, are you happy with how things are going? Do you feel that you're getting your money's worth from your General Assembly, that they are actually doing the things that need to be done for the Badger State? And if they were doing the things that you need to do in the Badger State, you'd beat Ohio State in football. Okay, let's just put that out there. But having said that and just cleared the air on that, I think what you want to look at is how's your economic development? Are you addressing the things that really speak to the average Wisconsin resident? Here we call them Bobby and Betty Buckeye. Is it addressing what they really want to see happen for jobs, infrastructure, transportation, and opportunities for their children and grandchildren? Are you happy with that? Fine, keep the current system. If you're not happy, look for something that will make sure that the needs of the general population are met, and also lower taxes. Ireland has had ranked choice voting for 100 years, and their taxes as a percent of GDP are 21.1. In America, we conservatives have long been trying to get us down to 20. We're at 26.6. And it's because in Ireland, they don't have to pay off special interest groups with money and things like that. So you look at this, if you really want to see a low-cost, very effective state that tends to the general population, Final Four or Final Five, different sifting mechanisms. You have salty caramel ice cream again. Two radically different sifting mechanisms to give the people the better chance of coming up with something that they go, wow, I really like this.
Yes, I should add that in my own conversation with conservatives about structural reforms like Final Four, Final Five, I very frequently kind of get an instantaneous response of, well, the key to getting better governance is that we just have to elect better people. To which I respond, absolutely, you should elect better people. Better people are simply better, and therefore, let's have more of them in the legislature doing the important work of governance. Yet, elections set incentive structures, and even the best of people have to respond to those incentives. Matt, you got something to say on this topic of how to talk to the right about structural election reform?
Yeah, and this is also another kind of area that means a lot to me. I served on my Republican County Executive Board. I served as Republican staff in the state legislature. The Republican Party has long been kind of a tribe of mine, and the folks that belong to it are my fellow tribesmen. I think what sticks out to me about this is two things. One, the Final Five or Final Four or this type of system is designed to empower voters. And that should not be a scary thing as a Republican voter. And in fact, it should be an exciting thing. If you have ever, as a Republican, found yourself in a position where you feel like you're picking between the lesser of two evils, this is a reform that addresses that problem. If you have ever participated in an election where the Republican candidate has substantial flaws, we can point back to that 2022 cycle around the country. We saw a number of Republican candidates make their way through a primary and become Republican voters, what they often felt was their only option. And they were stuck voting for someone that had substantial political baggage that turned off independents or persuadable swing voters and ultimately proved to be an unsuccessful general election candidate. Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, we could go down the list of states that could have been gettable by Republicans if they had put forward a candidate that was appealing to more voters. With this type of reform in place, voters would likely have more than one Republican option on the general election ballot. So if in the course of a general election campaign, news were to break that makes one candidate particularly unpalatable, you have a fallback. That should be considered to be a really substantial benefit to all voters, regardless of political persuasion, but in particular Republicans who might feel like there's a bit of a candidate quality concern within the party at the moment. Ranked choice voting and its use in a top 4 or top 5 system won't take a state that is overwhelmingly red and flip it blue, even though we talked about Alaska. I think Alaska is a bit of a unique circumstance, and it still remained predominantly red at every level. What it does instead was better align candidates with where the voters in that place are. And if it is a red district, it will remain a red seat. Instead, it will prevent really poor quality candidates from being the only option voters have on the ballot in November. And to me, that's nothing but upside.
All right. Thank you for that. We've hit 10 o'clock, and so we've got more audience questions that are coming in, and we're going to turn to those. But before we do that, I just wanted to note that for those of you who've got access to the platform known as X, if you search for the hashtag #AEI election reform, you'll see a couple of things I put out there. One is a useful resource on open primaries. It's a map showing which states have them and also which states sort of have them and which sort of don't and which clearly still have closed partisan primaries. And I would also suggest whether you like ranked choice voting, don't like ranked choice voting, if you want to get a state of the play, how many states have taken this up, how many cities are doing ranked choice voting, go to fairvote.org. They are an advocacy organization, but they are tracking where this policy is being enacted, and those data are accurate. And so you can satisfy your curiosity by taking a look at that. Now, I want to turn to another question we have. Does structural election reform in this current divisive national mood risk exacerbating election denial? Kevin Johnson, would you like to take that question?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I can understand the concern, but I think the answer is exactly the opposite. Going back to my time overseas, I was really surprised when I came back here at this intense, very narrow, very zero-sum game debate going on that sort of seems, takes the place of talking about where we can go in a democracy. And it's all about voting rights versus election security. And the more there's disagreement, it seems like the more the media wants to make that the only thing to talk about. Finding common ground is difficult in that debate. Finding common ground that both parties can actually benefit from a system that is more likely to elect a representative closer to the median vote of the party. Both parties can agree on that. They'll both have an easier time governing. So I think there is, and you make this point in your report, Kevin, that there's a difference between these structural reforms versus the common debate. And there's a sort of an opportunity in focusing on these reforms to sort of de-zero sum our discussion about what can be ahead for us as a democracy. I just made up a verb that doesn't exist at all. De-zero sum. That's a barbarism.
Gene, I wanted to ask you that same question. Structural reforms, when you got high voter suspicion about, the other side is trying to rip us off in some way, shape, or form, you get that sort of response like, hey, this is just a wolf in sheep's clothing that you're, trying to peddle or something like that. And, structural reforms, I mean, do you think it could drive people further into their bunkers who are kind of wound up on these topics, or is it an opportunity to come together?
I think it is an opportunity to come together, but I think we need to also relate this to the criticism of ranked choice voting that the people who hate this go, oh, wait, it's too confusing. The voters can't understand it. So last Thanksgiving, 13 months ago, I was at Thanksgiving with my eldest daughter, mid-40s, and she goes, Mom says you're going to be doing some interesting things next year. Daddy, what are you going to be doing? And I proceeded to tell her about ranked choice voting. And she goes, oh, Daddy, I know all about that. That's how we choose homecoming queens. So you will find ranked choice voting out there in some surprising instances. And we've brought up this story to other people as we've traveled around Ohio, and they immediately go, oh my gosh, yes, that's how we chose homecoming queens in Pike County was one example of it. So universities will use ranked choice voting sometimes for choosing department chairs. It is found in a variety of settings and a variety of different mechanisms. In other words, there's more than one. On the farm, what we say is we don't care what the cat looks like as long as it can catch mice. And we're saying much the same thing here. We need to understand there's more than one way to elect your people and how you're doing it now. I mean, look, this iPhone first came out, my gosh, 21 years ago. But yet, if we were to tell everybody, you still have to use the original iPhone and you can't upgrade even to a 12, okay? Oh my gosh, well, what are you doing? Well, we're saying now, after 240 years, let's do some modest upgrades that protect the institutions that we currently use to govern ourselves by. I'm a Burkean conservative, and one of the things I like most about these reforms is that it does so while protecting the institutions that we currently use.
All righty. Another question that has come in is, what are the strongest arguments made by opponents against structural reform, and how are they best answered? And I would put out there that, and it's something I recognized in my paper, that one of the responses to structural reforms that one gets, particularly from the right, is the argument of prudence. Conservatives are not supposed to believe in making radical policy changes. They're supposed to worry about things like unintended consequences, implementation errors. You can have a great plan in law or on paper, but then if the execution is poor, bad things can happen. And that can happen whenever you're trying something new, getting humans coordinated to make something work. We saw that a little bit when New York City tried its new election system the past time around. There was a little gaffe with the vote counting. They rectified it quickly, but it did rattle some nerves because they simply hadn't executed correctly. So, gentlemen, I have you. Let's start with you, Kevin Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. It is a very good question, and I'm going to answer it as regards the independent redistricting specifically, and maybe others can speak about other aspects of it. But I think the most common criticism that comes up is, well, how can we trust this body of citizens who've been selected through this process will actually sort of operate in a way independent from politics? Won't there be a lot of risks for very red Republicans or very blue Democrats to kind of cheat the system and work their way in? And I think that goes to our image that's central to our work of the referee. I mean, they talk about a simple idea that people understand. Everyone realizes no sporting league has a chance if it doesn't have referees. Everyone knows that those referees probably started life, being Yankees fans or Red Sox fans back when they were kids. But there's a structure, a way to recruit them, a way to train them, and an institution that makes it work. We do that all the time. We create institutions that have sufficient buffers, and we should have confidence that we can do that. And in fact, the reality is showing that that's working. The independent redistricting commissions, I've had a number of really encouraging conversations with folks that have been on them, and they all say it's ending up being, more than the sum of its parts. These things are often structured, say, with 5 people who are, Republicans, 5 people who are Democrats, 5 people who are independent, who are selected. Those are affiliations. None of them can be a professional politician. None of them is an insider. And that's the key to creating that separation. And what the folks say is the experience of having these meetings and going through the process of making the maps is not one where they find themselves as agents for that party whose affiliation they were named, but instead, kind of like a jury, they see themselves as a group of people with an ennobling task that citizens should be proud to do, that together they rise to achieve. We have that in our human spirit. Our polarization makes us not believe that it's there. And just that we are leveraging that example in developing at ERN a new approach to how state election boards should work. The same concept can work there. State election boards right now, we're sort of 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. Go ahead and fight, see who wins. We can create a new form of a board that represents parties, but also other important stakeholders, and we'll have an easier time coming to resolution. So I think there's a lot to be gained there. Over to you.
Yeah, Matt Germer, do you want to get in here about kind of what you've heard as far as like the strongest arguments against systemic reforms, and how do you respond to those?
Yeah, so there's 2 that stick out to me. One that I hear often is that ideas like an instant runoff using ranked choice voting are confusing for voters. And I will admit, as someone who is an advocate of these reforms and personally who just thinks that they have a lot of power, sitting down with someone and talking about you're going to rank all these people, you're going to drop people off, you're going to reallocate votes can sound really confusing at that kind of surface level when you're first introduced. And I think that's often the fault of folks in my position who enjoy the political science of it and lose sight of what it's like for a voter on the ground. In real life, though, in the states that have actually implemented ranked choice voting or in localities that have tried it, if you hand someone a ballot and said rank the candidates, people know what to do. And as they start to see how the system works, it starts to make intuitive sense. And this is a point that kind of Gene brought up before. It's a system that's not exclusive to picking your elected leaders. It gets used across the country in a variety of other contexts because there's a certain intuitive nature to it. And so I think that one of the ways to grapple with the it's confusing argument is to show someone what a ranked choice ballot looks like. They'll know how to fill it out. And second, to point to polling from folks after they've participated in a ranked choice election that shows overwhelming majorities who knew what to do when given the ballot and who enjoyed the process. And this includes states, deep red Republican states like Utah, that have used ranked choice voting for their county elections. The vast majority of Utahns who have used ranked choice voting like it, and they want to keep the system going forward. The other pushback that I have heard, and I'll be brief as I know we're starting to approach the end of our time here, is that this primary reform, really any primary reform, there's a concern that gets brought up that it weakens the parties, and that as conservatives, we should be looking to build institutions and not weaken them. And I think there's a lot of merit to that position. I am someone who is concerned about the weakened parties in our country. But with the way things are now, under the status quo, parties are weaker than ever. And they're anemic, and they're really not able to do their jobs, even with closed partisan primaries. And we can point toward a variety of other factors, whether it's just institutions crumbling generally, campaign finance reform. We can kind of go down the list as to what it is that's creating weak parties. But at this point, the parties are already weak, and we are in a position where we've got terrible incentives, weak parties, bad candidates, and frustrated voters. It's kind of a worst case scenario situation. The solution to that isn't going to be a return to smoke-filled rooms. I don't see that as being a real solution that voters would accept. So recognizing that we have a problem and analyzing what solutions are actually on the table, the kind of primary reforms like we've seen in Alaska and that are on the ballot in places like Nevada and potentially Arizona soon, to me, that kind of top 4, top 5 system finds a real solution that empowers voters And hopefully parties can adapt and adopt new systems themselves to maintain their real value that they have in our system.
All right. Another question that came up, and we are in fact getting close to our concluding time, was a fellow who notes that, and I know he's on the right. He tweets that there are a lot of folks on the right who don't trust ranked choice voting. They've heard bad things about it, and so for people to push that towards them, may not work so well. And he suggests, why not something else like approval voting, which doesn't have that negative variance? To which I will respond, why not? Absolutely. I think the states should be experimenting with a whole variety of systems to see what's going to work, what can move the needle. And, being in favor, as, one person might be of ranked choice voting doesn't preclude other people from being in favor of other reforms. And in fact, I would say, one of the geniuses of America is that we allow for diversity of reform. We do not have a central government that's pushing down a single best reform onto our diverse republic. All right, let me get to this one last question that we have time for, because we have hit the 10:15 hour. And I want to fob this question over to you, Gene Krebs, which is, in many states, the referendum is not a vehicle for enacting systemic reform. That means systemic reform is going to have to go through a legislature. The folks in that legislature, they're with the current system. They are winners in the current system by virtue of holding their position. How can they be brought around to making a change in the very system that they're within?
Wow. So this reminds me of that famous quote by Machiavelli, where he said that those who are promoting a new order of things immediately run into those who are currently benefiting from the current order, and they have to overcome all their resistance. At the same time, those who are going to benefit from it may not be aware of all the benefits that may accrue to them from the new system. So for this goes, I'm a political cyclist. And I don't mean I get on a bicycle and I ride around stuff. But what I'm referring to is Peter Turchin and his secular cycles. I'm referring to Skroenek from Yale and the presidential cycle, Strauss and Howe, and their great turnings, and even Phyllis Tickle from a theological standpoint in the 500-year cycle that Christianity and Judaism finds themselves into. If they don't get behind this, they're in danger of being swept into literally the dustbin of history. And I'll give you a case in point. In 1995, at our caucus retreat, we had the prominent Republican pollster come in and say to us, "You now own the college educated." They vote every opportunity. They vote all the way down the ticket. And for a member of the General Assembly, that's critical, because so many people just vote for the federals and move on. If you look closely at the August election here on that issue 1 that would have thwarted the will of the people by making referendum so difficult, it was the college-educated Republican precincts, for example, where John Boehner himself lives, that voted overwhelmingly to squash this power grab by my friends and colleagues. So in other words, if you don't give citizens a certain safety valve in all of this, the pressures will build until the point where they completely overthrow what you're trying to do. And at that point in time, I can't save you, because you've now made your bed. You're going to have to lie in it, and you're going to be known as the Whigs of this century. And so I'm very clear to them. You either manage the change, or the change will manage you. And the citizens, especially in a state like, once again, I go back to in Ohio, because of term limits, we've evolved faster and quicker than many other states have on all political issues. Get with the program now. Otherwise, I can't save you.
All right. Thank you, Gene. Well, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to Kevin. Thank you to Gene for being with us today and for sharing your wisdom, your perspectives. And thank you to all of you out there in the audience. We had quite a slew of questions. Unfortunately, we're not able to get them all in. I myself will be heading out to Twitter and the hashtag AEI election reform and trying to respond to some of these questions that didn't get answered. And if any of my fellow panelists have time in their busy schedules to join me, that would be great. But to you in the audience, thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the program, and I hope you'll share the YouTube video of this program, which you'll find on youtube.com/@AEI/videos. Again, thank you all, and have a great day.